Hello, friends, and welcome back to Heartforward, Conversations from the Heart. This is Carrie Morrison. Last fall, when we were able to travel, remember those days? I escorted a group of 38 Californians to the biannual International Mental Health Conference in Trieste, Italy. It was an eye-opening week for all of those who had not previously visited this remarkable city. They could see with their own eyes how this city models a community-based system of mental health care for its residents. Upon my return, one of my travel colleagues, feeling quite moved by their non-clinical system, which values social connection, horizontal relationships, and uplifts the human right to pursuing purpose and work, told me about the work of Dr. Mary Watkins at Pacifica Graduate Institute in Santa Barbara. At that time, Dr. Watkins was close to publishing an amazing book, Mutual Accompaniment and the Creation of the Commons. So I put that book at the top of my pandemic reading pile, and I found so much in these pages which aligns with what we have seen so beautifully modeled in Trieste. Dr. Watkins' book underscores for me that we are capable of these caring and non-clinical approaches in America. We are unfortunately constrained by systems and by our cultural disposition toward hierarchy and toward a pursuit of individualism, which marginalizes family and support networks. So join me in a conversation with Dr. Watkins about the nature of mutual accompaniment and what it might look like in an American context. Hi, welcome to Heartforward, Conversations from the Heart. And today I'm really delighted to have with me via Zoom, unfortunately. I would have much preferred to drive up the coast to Santa Barbara to do this face-by-face, but in the future, Dr. Mary Watkins, who has written a book that I have pretty much underlined almost every line on every page. This book resonated with me so completely. It's called Mutual Accompaniment and the Creation of the Commons. And there are so many topics and thoughts in this book that resonate with things that I saw at work in Trieste, Italy, and my visits there, and just learning about an entirely different way that people with mental illness are cared for in the community. And when I was reading the book and found that she even wrote about Dr. Franco Basaglia and the influence he had on community-based care and social accompaniment and just the therapeutic value of human connection, I was really, really excited to bring her onto this podcast. So, Mary, I'm so glad you're here. And I'd love to know a little bit about your origin story, where you were born and how you entered into this field. And you've got some marvelous anecdotes in your book about early days, some of the ways that you were interacting with clients or patients or people that I know kind of shaped the person you are today. So give us a little sense of your background.
Okay, thank you very much, Carrie. I was born in Texas, but I grew up in New York in a completely Southern family from Memphis. And I developed an interest in psychology really early on, started reading psychology in high school. And was very disappointed when I got to college at what was being taught as psychology. So I've taken a kind of critical path from the beginning. But I was introduced to the work of R.D. Laing in college and his experiment at Kingsley Hall. And so when I graduated from college, I tried to find a place in the United States that was set up a little bit like Kingsley Hall. And for your listeners who don't know what Kingsley Hall was a place created by the Philadelphia Association in London to create a residential housing and small community for people going through psychosis. And instead of treating them with neuroleptics and ordinary psychotherapy, people who were not going through psychosis accompanied people who were and lived together in a community setting. So I found a place like that in Cambridge called WellMet Project, a little different. It was more of a transition house for young adults who had been inside inpatient mental hospitals for a while, who are now making a transition into the community. And they had a setup where people like myself could live for free room and board, but we had to provide some work for the house. So my work was creating dinner for everybody every night. But I needed a little cash. So at the same time, I got a job as a mental health worker at the city hospital, Cambridge City Hospital, right down the road. And I was there from 11 o'clock at night till 7 o'clock in the morning. So I got introduced at the very same time to inpatient hospitalization in the United States, which at that point in 1972 was using kind of heavy drugs and also electroshock therapy. At the same time as living in a much more liberatory, sort of hopeful community with young people. And those two tracks sort of continued to develop in my life because I went on to graduate school and studied phenomenological psychology, developmental psychology, clinical psychology, became, in other words, professionalized. But always experienced a gap between the way in which professional life sort of segregates you into a setting in which you're more comfortable, perhaps, less vulnerable, perhaps, emotionally, which is really abstracted from the lives of the people that you're trying to be with. So in about 1985, I had been doing clinical work for about 15 years or so, and I came across the work of liberation psychology. And that really changed the course of my own trajectory. And in liberation psychology, which came from Latin America, is this word accompaniment.
Yeah, so I'm so glad the liberation psychology, and I'm not a practitioner or professional in this space. I consider myself to be a member of the public that it resonates so well in your work on mutual accompaniment. There's places for people like me to plug in because I don't have initials after my name, whatever. So before we get into that, just that word liberation psychology it just doesn't fit. It doesn't really kind of describe. I'm like, whoa, people are free to do what? What's the origin of that word? Tell us a little bit more about it, because I know it really underscores a lot of what you are doing now.
Yes. Well, I began with the work of Paulo Freire, and he created a literacy program in Northeast Brazil in the 1970s and early 80s before he was forced into exile by the dictatorship there. And for me, it was like a missing half of psychology because he, first of all, wasn't treating individuals. He was inviting community groups to talk together about what they knew about the things that were creating difficulties in their communities and thus also psychosocial misery, and was helping them understand how the situations which needed transformation had gotten put into place. Who did they serve? Who was profiting off of them? And to use their own knowledge as a kind of mosaic to put it together so that they could figure out how would they want things to be different and what could they do together to transform them. His work was really a beginning in liberation psychology that was carried forward by a Spanish priest named Ignacio Martín Baró in El Salvador, who was one of the Jesuits who was murdered in 1989. And he was borrowing from liberation theology, which was a corrective to the Catholic Church not to be supportive of the interest of elites, but to turn their attention toward the majorities, giving a preferential option for the poor. And so it was within the Catholic Church saying, we need to make social justice our priority. And to do that, we need to partner and be alongside the people who are going to be part of this transformation, those who have been left out. So when Martín Baró went to University of Chicago, he got many graduate degrees, but when he got one in social psychology in the US and went back to El Salvador, where he was living, he said he couldn't make use of what he'd learned, that it was inappropriate to the situation in which he found himself, which was in a growing civil war between a very small number of elites and a very strong military against many Salvadoran people. So he really posed to psychologists, he said, you have to figure out if you're going to accompany people or not. Are you going to be practicing your profession to only help elites, or are you going to figure out ways of being alongside the people who are actually experiencing the most psychosocial distress in your society?
Yeah, it seems, as you write about liberation psychology and you juxtapose it against where Western psychotherapy has gone, there's this rigidness and professionalization in the Western world. We have clinical hours, you make an appointment, there's like a risk management protocol to not get too heavily involved in people's lives, the reliance upon evidence-based practice, and the fact that the rules need to be followed because you run the risk of straying into, lawsuits or HIPAA violations or whatever it might be if you actually come too close to somebody. And as I was reading how you described liberation psychology, it's like being available to people in their lives, like taking walks with them, listening, allowing the discretion to be present in a way that is needed for that person at that time, which sounds so natural. It sounds so human. So was it in the 70s then that our Western approach here kind of took this fork in the road that we missed out on?
Well, I want to underline the fact that American psychology as a whole is really grounded on a very individualistic understanding of the person, and in general abstracts the person from their sociocultural and historical context. So a key learning for me in the 80s was a work by Arthur Kleinman, who's a psychiatrist and an anthropologist and a psychiatric epidemiologist who's working in several different cultures. And what he ended up finding from his studies was that if you look at where people are suffering the most sort of psychological difficulty, and then you look at what the context is that they're living in, you can begin to see the kinds of social situations that create great stress on human beings. And they include what you would anticipate if you stop to think about it, right? Racism, sexism, poverty, forced migration, violence of all kinds, from domestic violence all the way to genocide. Poverty not only in and of itself, but when you're living without the resources that you need, and several blocks over, people have excess resources. It's a particularly difficult psychological situation. And so he said we have to begin to think about trauma not as an individual occurrence that has something to do with just the sort of like familial history that the person has been living in. Of course, sometimes things happen in families where that is the case, but that we have to look at the social, economic, political structures that give rise to what he decided to call social misery. And so this is a shift from an individualistic understanding of the person to what I would call an interdependent understanding. And so one reason when I use the word accompaniment, I put psychosocial in front of it, or I put eco-psychosocial to also underline that we're not only in a sociocultural environment, we're also, our lives happen in places. And those places have particular both gifts and beauties, but also stresses, as we can all experience at the moment.
So you explore some of these places. You mentioned Kingsley Hall and what you tried to replicate when you were coming out of school with living. I can't believe that you cooked dinner and then worked all night.
Lots of energy when you're 21.
Right. That's a conversation for another day. But what I loved is the whole section on radical hospitality, where you define some of the examples going back even to the 1800s, the social settlements and houses of hospitality. Tell us a little bit about what those movements were. And is there any remnant of that in the United States today?
Yes. Well, it's interesting. In my 20s, I was reading psychology over here, but on the other side, I was reading Dorothy Day and Jane Addams, Thomas Merton, and people like that. And I didn't quite see how you put it together. It's taken me quite a while. But with Jane Addams' work, she was an upper middle class, privileged white woman growing up in the Midwest in the late 1800s. And after her father died, she was involved in this kind of trip to see museums in Europe with her stepmother and began to feel a great depression and a great sense of lack of meaning in her life as a person and as a woman. And she went to one of the first settlement houses in London called Toynbee Hall, which was an effort to have university students who had means live in neighborhoods in London that were quite poor and to begin to share experiences. So she decided that when she went back to Chicago, she would try to assemble a group of women who would like to create a house in a neighborhood in Chicago that was filled with immigrants who were really struggling with being new immigrants and with being poor in highly industrialized city. And that became Hull House. And she started by saying, I don't know what these people are living. The only way I'm going to get to know is to live right in the same neighborhood and to start making friendships and to leave my door open so people can come and tell me about their lives, and to do it not just I myself, but with a group and with a community. This was a very important part of the settlement house history in the United States, which began to create participatory action projects where instead of neighborhoods and immigrant neighborhoods being researched by academicians, neighborhood people and the residents of the settlement house would meet together to consider things like, how are we going to get clean water? What are we going to do about child labor, etc. Hull House, for those who have been to Chicago, you can still see remnants of it, but it became a place where 1,000 people would come in and out every week because there were adult education classes, music classes, kindergartens, after school programs, language programs, art studios, art museum showings of the cultural arts of the various immigrants that had come in. And the settlement houses had a very vital life during the progressive era in the early 1900s, but they became increasingly professionalized. And when that happened, people no longer lived in those neighborhoods. They traveled in from their more elite neighborhoods to work as professionals in the settlement houses. And I think that they really transformed. Another person that really inspired me was Dorothy Day, who in a very similar search as Jane Addams for a meaningful life, and she was a journalist in New York City. She began with Peter Marr and her friendship with him to begin to think about what it would be like to create a house where people who didn't have a place, who were unhoused, could gain a sense of safety. And as she was thinking about that, her doorbell rang and a woman looked very, very tragically sad. And Dorothy Day asked her in and said, what's happened? And she said, my friend and I, we've been without a place to be. And my friend was so despairing this morning that she threw herself in front of a subway and died. And so Dorothy Day knew that she had to start it right then. And she started the first Catholic worker house. And now there are Catholic worker houses all over the world. There are many in the United States that do incredible work by providing housing, food, clothing, and what I call accompaniment. Again, it's like a social accompaniment because people who are unhoused find themselves at the peril of a great deal of neglect and of the neglect of creating the kind of social structures that support people in creating dignified and secure lives. A person quite like her was Jean Vanier, who also happened to be a Catholic. And he was a university professor in Canada. He was in France and was invited to a place where men suffering intellectual disabilities were essentially housed in an asylum-like setting. And he was horrified by what he saw. And after some months of thinking about it, he decided to ask two of the men that he had met to move in with him in a house in Trousley. And they accepted. Some people without intellectual disabilities wanted to move in also. And pretty soon they had a house. And pretty soon other people with intellectual disabilities and without them wanted to move in. And then they had 3 houses. And now they became known as the L'Arche communities. Those are all over the world. And have really shown the ways in which communities can be constructed amongst people with different kinds of ways of being in the world, different gifts of what they see and bring, so that it isn't a matter of like one group of people helping another group of people, as we think of in human services, but of forming life together, of being alongside each other, of accompanying each other. So in my book, there was an issue. My editor didn't originally understand why I needed to put mutual in front of the word accompaniment. But I wanted to underscore that this is that there's a reciprocal process of what happens to your own life as an accompanist and being open to being accompanied by others. This is something that Jane Addams and Dorothy Day and Jean Vanier were very clear about, that the richness of their life had everything to do with the relationships that they had formed in these settings.
Yeah, it was as I was reading your book, and again, underlining everything with stars and asterisks. And when I went to Trieste for the first time and participated in a mental health conference there, it was a global conference. I remember at that conference, there were 36 countries represented and not a single speaker from the United States, because we really do not have much to offer in this space. But I remember how they stressed the horizontal relationship between, as they called it, the users in their system and the so-called professionals. That there would actually be a slide showing this is a horizontal relationship, not a vertical relationship. The just because you're a psychiatrist or a psychiatric nurse, you had no special stature relative to the relationship that you entered into with the users of the system. And for coming from an American context where such an emphasis is placed on education and graduate degrees and clinical acumen. And I would often find myself, people would say, well, are you a clinician? I'm like, no, I'm a human being who cares about this issue. The distinction is significant. And I think about in our world of ending homelessness, where in America, we believe the solution is to move people into their own apartment and close the door. And yet, as we talk about people with severe mental illness, I've observed that is not a strategy that works. And we don't have enough examples of communal living opportunities for people to create a sense of family or community that would create mutual reliance. So let's talk a little bit about what is perhaps preventing kind of an embracing of mutual accompaniment in the world in which we are trying to come alongside people with severe mental illness in our society.
Thank you. And can I also address what needs to happen instead of closing the door? Because I think Basaglia was very clear about what needs to happen. And he was not concerned that people had graduate degrees, but they had to have a certain set of qualities. One was that they could appreciate that every person has what he calls a life project, and that you need to be the kind of person who can be with another person with your ear attuned to what's that life project? Where does that person come alive? What is it that matters to them? What are their values? Insofar as you can you be a bridge to help them gain the resources to help that life project flower more than it might be already? And we know that people need a sense of social inclusion. So they need to be living in a house or a neighborhood and a workplace where their way of being in the world is respected, and where the things that they can contribute are valued and appreciated. So it's often called a Basagliani, the people that would be like what we would think of as mental health workers. They had to be people who could learn new things. Perhaps the person that they were working with needed to figure out where they could be placed to work in a bakery. And maybe the Basagliani doesn't know anything about bakeries and needs to figure that out to help make a transition there. So, in the US, we have generally had the idea that when a person has psychiatric difficulties, that you remove them into treatment settings. And this is what was happening before deinstitutionalization. But during the time when we were doing that, if you compared how people who were diagnosed with schizophrenia and psychosis were doing in the United States with the best first world mental health care, the best psychopharmacology, compare them to similar people in India were doing much, much better. They were recovering at a much higher rate. And so you look at what was the difference. They were still living with their families. They weren't removed from their family. They weren't removed from their neighborhood. They weren't removed from meaningful work. They were given some work that they could do. So there was still a sense of social inclusion, of housing alongside other people who care about you. And also a hopeful attitude, because in India, psychosis wasn't seen as a long-term predictor of a lifelong mental illness. Even schizophrenia was seen as a short-term acute situation, rather than in the US, when parents would find out that their 20-year-old had schizophrenia, it was often presented to them as though it was some kind of life sentence, which isn't necessarily true at all, depending on how that person is accompanied by their family, their neighborhood, their Basagliani, etc.
What is it about the American system that makes it difficult for those accompaniment relationships to flourish?
First of all, mental health care happens within a capitalist system. And that means that the more education you have, the more highly remunerated you are, and the more you have to enact the role of the expert in order to have your own salary, right? There isn't a sensibility about, in some ways, sidelining the professionals, allowing them to do some of the things that they're quite good at, but really building a group of people with qualities that don't require graduate education to be alongside people who want accompaniment. And what would they do? They would help in housing situations where, instead of people having their own apartment where you close the door on them, people meet together for meals. People who accompany you to your job until you get settled there. If you have an episode, perhaps they take over your job for a few weeks until you can take it back on again. That's a practice that's done at Fountain House, a place that you'll be talking about in a podcast to come. So again, we have to swim across, counter to the tide of individualism and professionalism. And we also have to fund these alternatives. So, for instance, if we think about police abolition and defunding the police, for instance, what people are really talking about there is taking money from retributive kinds of processes and putting them in places where people have the resources to have, in the case of people with mental illness, stable housing, a guaranteed income, which can be increased if they are part of a social cooperative, for instance, access to healthcare when they want it, access to support during particularly difficult period. With those kinds of community supports in place, people can do surprisingly well and become and be members of the community that others seek out and want to be around and value. So it's an uphill path, as you yourself know.
When I was, one of my previous trips, I asked, because I've been there 5 times now, and I said, please show me where are the people with the most serious mental illness living, because we're not doing a very good job of this in the United States. Many of these people are in jail or homeless, or they're not thriving in traditional supportive housing. And I visited this apartment complex where there was 24/7 roundabout a live-in person on 3 shifts, kind of like you back when you were 19. And the minute you walked in, you talk about radical hospitality. There was coffee brewing. There was some fresh pastries there waiting for us. There was a pet. I just found pets everywhere, which to me was the therapeutic value of pets is significant. We toured the complex. Some people had rooms to themselves. Some people had shared rooms, but it was all open door. And there was a sense that you could flow throughout. And there were people with lived experience, peers, who were there helping. Just like you say, ready, let's go to the bus. Where there was like requirement to get out of the apartment each day and to go do something in the community. And I was just so touched by what I saw. And I've been wondering, like, why can't we do that? We have to try to do this because it is, as you say, a place of recovery.
Yes. And you can start anywhere. You could, like Jean Beignet, he started with 2 people, right? And then because it was a very good idea, the idea grew. It inspired other people. People wanted to be part of it. Amazing people went to be part of it, are still being part of it. But I'll just quickly allude to the kind of structure that we find in something like Partners in Health, Paul Farmer's organization that he co-founded, where you need to be at the grassroots level with folks while also be building networks of support in the community, working with funding that's usually at a different level, and also working at a policy level around these situations. So again, that's why I say psychosocial, because it's not only being alongside a person in the literal sense of alongside, but alongside the structural dilemmas that are besetting them at various levels of organization in the culture.
So I want to touch upon this word institutional. Again, what I was learning in Trieste is this notion of the anti-institution, that they work very hard to refute anything that would appear to be institutional. I remember Googling, what is an institution? Because it is so pervasive in the United States. But in your words, what is an institution? How prevalent is institutional ethos in the United States system? And what might we have to do to try to move away from that?
Well, again, we can take a lesson from Franco Basaglia. So we know that he was in charge of several asylums. And in the second one, was it in Gorizia?
Gorizia.
No,
San Giovanni.
Yeah. He had to face the brutal fact, and it wasn't easy, that the asylum didn't exist for the benefit of its inhabitants. It existed for the benefits of the professionals, the nurses, the doctors, and that the asylum that was supposed to be making people better, so the institution that was supposed to be making people better, was actually deepening their difficulties. So we have to ask with institutions, who is the institution for? Who profits from the institution? What holds the institution in place if the institution is failing or has already failed at its stated mission? If it's failing at its stated mission, but it's still in place, what's the unstated mission that it's performing? I mean, it's not to say that all institutions are negative. Obviously, there's going to be some institutions that serve for the benefit of a common good. But to determine that, you would have to ask the consumers or the users if an institution that is claiming it's doing that, is that their experience of it? And I remember interviews that we did at the Yale Neuropsychiatric Institute in the 80s, where we were talking with people diagnosed with schizophrenia about why they went to the hospital during certain phases of psychosis. And many would say, I didn't want to go to the hospital. If I'd had some other place to go, I would have gone there. I didn't need to be in a hospital, and I didn't like being locked up, and I didn't like being given the drugs I was given necessarily. I wanted to go to a home. I wanted to go to some place where people cared about me. I wanted to sleep in a bed where there were other people sleeping, where I wasn't alone because I was afraid, right? And so we get a sense of from the inside, the institution wasn't the best place for some people. They wanted something else, but you had to listen to what it was and then work together to bring it about. And to his credit, Larry Davidson at Yale really did work hard to do that.
So the Neuropsychiatric Institute was not UCLA, it was at Yale where you did these interviews?
Yeah.
And so what did he bring about then?
Well, there's a beautiful book about it by Larry Davidson, Johnny Strauss, and Jacob Ruckfelt. I think they created a structure outside of the hospital where more like a neighborhood house that connected people with resources where people could be, where you would go and know the people who were there and they knew you. And so you have friendships, right? You have friendships.
What a concept, right?
Right. Like from accompaniment is the word compañero, a friend, right?
Does that still exist?
Yes. Yes.
It does. Okay.
Yeah.
Because we could use something like that in Los Angeles. I don't think we have anything like that. So, you mentioned going back to the psychiatrist or just even the professional, I don't want to necessarily call out psychiatrists, who reach a certain level of remuneration and stature, I guess. That is not going to be the group that we could pin our hopes on for some kind of cultural change in America. So I'm curious, especially since you're in a university setting, are there young psychiatrists and psychologists coming along who recognize that this system of hierarchy and vertical positioning and whatnot is working against accompaniment and recovery and human connection and would be willing to spur a bit of a revolution in our country?
We're asking a lot of young people who are trying to, for instance, become psychologists because they're in a set of highly prescribed classes to gain licensure, and they're in primarily settings that are part of the institutionalization of all this. However, when I speak at different clinical psychology graduate programs in the United States, I always find young people who are searching for a different way because it doesn't feel right to them, some of the things that they're having to do. And so, yes, I think so. But I also don't think we need PhDs necessarily to do this work. I think, there used to be this category called mental health worker, which was more like a BA, after your BA, where you gained experience by being with people. And I think that there could be, a much different kind of training. So, for instance, in my program that I co-founded at Pacifica, we decided to let go of all the clinical courses. Because we didn't want that to be the foundation. And students are doing a lot of different things in the community settings. They're not, it's not all about mental illness at all. But we're more attuned to say, how do you create with others a public home place, a place where people's individual virtues are affirmed, where relationships are developed, where people have a chance to understand some of the social structures that have influenced the directions of their life, where they can enjoy music and art together, etc. It's those kinds of skills, if you will, that I think we really need to be working on. The more sort of home places that we have, the more vibrant and alive people's lives will be. And that has everything to do with feeling glad you're alive, with a sense of recovery and a sense of being able to share what you've learned with others as they go through difficult times themselves.
So with your students, is there an opportunity to have that kind of immersive experience of being in relationship, whether maybe living or at least accompanying individuals, to have that practical experience?
Yes. So our students have what we call community and ecological fieldwork, where they, for 2 years, one of their quarters each year is in that kind of immersive experience. And they're working with many, many different kinds of social issues and ecological issues. But we have had students who are involved in this kind of work. As you know, your friend Alyssa Ordoña, as part of her fieldwork, she created a public home place right near the LAX airport where many people came to speak with each other. Poets came, people who are unhomed came, mothers with children came to create what she called a literary cafe.
Yeah, we just got to string those together. And Alyssa is the one who introduced me to you, and I'm so grateful. And Father Frank Buckley, also at the center in Blessed Sacrament, is also a big fan of yours as well. So we have been destined to connect. So I want to kind of just end on thinking about the future. On my screensaver on my computer, when I open it up each morning, I have a picture of Sisyphus pushing a rock up a hill, because I feel like I've seen something so beautiful in Trieste. And I know there's examples all throughout the world. That just happened to be where I stumbled. And it gave me hope that we could treat people better. And when we brought a team of 5 people from Trieste to Los Angeles in 2018 to see our system for a week. And we took them to Skid Row and to LA County Jail, and they saw people chained to furniture. And I was so ashamed to be an American. And we visited locked facilities and the psychiatric hospital with restraints. And these are all things that don't exist in Italy. And I remember when we sat down with one of the members of the County Board of Supervisors, and our visitors were asked, "What was your experience so far?" And one of the psychiatrists said, "You may think that you closed the asylum in America, but we just walked through an open air asylum in Skid Row." And the room just kind of went super quiet, because seeing what we have, in a sense, become used to in a weird way through their eyes was, I'll never, ever forget that. But we have to have hope. And hope is like, the definition of hope, as I've looked it up, is to desire with the expectation of the obtainment of fulfillment. So do you have hope with these young people you're meeting with your book and how it has been maybe appreciated by people with new connections you've made? Do you have hope that we can make the cultural shift in America that moves away from these individualistic, vertical relationships into something that is more horizontal, mutually reciprocal? I mean, it's not going to happen overnight, but do you have hope that we could do much better?
I know we could do much better. And I think it begins with individual places of hospitality, of radical hospitality, and of being with and alongside in horizontal relationships. And the Zapatistas in southern Chiapas have a map of what they call autonomous communities all over the world. And they put on this map the little stars for each autonomous community. An autonomous community is a place where things are arrived at through consensus, where one is able to take what one needs, but also has the responsibility of taking care of the resources that others will need, etc. And their vision is that one day all those separate little stars will converge into a transformed kind of way of being with each other. In Sri Lanka, the Sarvodaya movement says that it took 500 years to get to the place that we're at now through colonialism. It's going to take 500 years to have a world that has peace. And they've actually made a plan how that's going to happen. So I think we have to have a long arc of our imagination while beginning to work in particular settings and creating with others, in solidarity with others, creating. And, I remember walking into Alyssa Ordonez's literary cafe. And when you went in there, you had a sense of love, of life, of laughter, brightness, even though there were a lot of different difficulties that were converging there. And those are the places we have to be kind of dedicated to bringing about with others. So I applaud your work, Carrie. I think you're raising people's consciousness about what you saw. It's just so beautiful, because only then can we begin to say, this could be very, very different.
Yeah, I'm going to follow up with you on the notion of these autonomous communities, because I've had this sense of what I would call bright spots of hope, even in our country, like Fountain House and other places that we know of. And that I just feel like my job is to keep telling this story and to surface these bright spots, these autonomous communities, and we will start to find each other. And it took us 40 years in America to arrive at this place since we closed our institutions. I hope it doesn't take us 40 years to come out of it, but it could be a generational change that we're looking at. And this is maybe the beginning. So I'm so thrilled to have had this conversation with you. I do look forward to coming up the coast one day and meeting you for coffee and not having to wear a mask.
Yes, let's do it.
Maybe even giving you a hug. Let's do it. So as soon as we get the all clear, there's so many people I want to see again. But I so appreciate your time today, and you give me hope, just the fact that you're not giving up either. So we won't give up together.
Good. It's a deal. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mary. I love how Dr. Watkins expresses a sense of hope that we can do better in America and how we might connect the dots by finding the autonomous communities who are in alignment throughout the country. And I also love the challenge she lays out for us. Start small and commit to places where we can model radical hospitality and let the transformative power of those social networks flourish. I encourage you to read her book and let me know where you have seen examples of mutual accompaniment play out in your community. Next week, I hope you will join me for a conversation with Dr. Dave Pilon, a psychologist who has had a huge influence on me. He has had a distinguished career, and most recently, he was retained by the LA County Department of Mental Health to translate the guiding principles that have so inspired us in Trieste into a proposed system change pilot intended for Hollywood. In the meantime, please take a moment to subscribe to this podcast if you have not already, and tell others about it. I want to thank my collaborating partners at Peer Mental Health for providing the technical support, and most in particular, Paul Robinson, who is helping with this podcast today. I look forward to seeing you next week.